Good evening, I'm Donald McCormick. Welcome to BBC Parliament as we look back 30 years to the night the government fell. The events of the 28th of March 1979 are among the most dramatic in Westminster history. MPs debated a motion of no confidence in the Labour administration. The government had to argue for its very existence, an argument they would lose by just one vote. But that was enough. The Prime Minister, James Callaghan, was forced to resign and call an early general election. An election that would sweep the Conservatives to power and usher in the era of Margaret Thatcher. Tonight on BBC Parliament, we'll relive that historic evening 30 years ago. Back then, I was standing in the rain on a different balcony not far from here, presenting the Tonight programme, and the weather is just as chilly as it was 30 years ago. Labour had won the general election of October 1974 with an overall majority of just 3 seats. Quite soon that majority crumbled, and for years the government survived only by striking deals with the smaller parties, including a fully fledged pact with the Liberals. That ended in 1978 when the Liberals left the pact. The government had lost its majority. After the strikes and the power cuts and facing an increasingly confident Conservative opposition, Jim Callaghan found that his luck had run out. But let's begin tonight with the inside story of what really went on back in 1979. Carolyn Quinn presents A Parliamentary Coup.
It was by far the most exciting parliamentary occasion that I've ever been a part of.
I'm not prophesying. We shall know in about 13 and a half hours, and I'm prepared to wait.
We knew we had no confidence in the government. The critical thing was whether we could persuade the House of Commons that it had no confidence in the government.
Every single vote was going to count. We hadn't the slightest doubt that this was the big one.
Very good. Are you very cold there, are you?
This was a war between two fundamentally opposed forces for the soul and the future of the country.
By March 1979, Jim Callaghan had spent almost 3 years at number 10 Downing Street. For much of that time, his party had no majority in Parliament. Labour had won the general election of October 1974 with a narrow majority of 3, but that had been whittled away through by-election defeats and defections. Labour managed to stay in power thanks to deals with smaller parties, including a pact with the Liberals, and through the efforts of its own party managers, the whips.
There were 4 people in charge of maintaining the government in office. There was Michael Foot, he was the leader of the House who decides what the business is. Michael Cox, he was the chief whip. There was Walter Harrison, who was the deputy chief whip, and a guy called Jack Dormond, who was the pairing whip, who would balance and say, if somebody's at death's door, find somebody at death's door on the other side and we'll cancel them out. And they were nicknamed the Fix-It Four, and they were called Footing It, Dormant, Harassment and Cock-Up, and everybody called them that.
By March 1979, after a hard winter of industrial strife, Labour's luck was running out, but the whips were going to fight on till the bitter end. This is the story of that battle.
The 70s and then the 80s were very rough, brutal times. Punch-ups in the streets, demos and everything going. It was a very hard time, and there were fights, you know. They came from tough backgrounds of coal miners, many more manual workers in them. Very few women, and the women had to put up with the jokes and the right ribaldry and all the lewd, but they were tough. Betty Boothroyd, people like that, Ann Taylor, they were tough.
In Parliament, the battles were fought out in the chamber night after night. A lost vote could force Labour from office, something the Conservative opposition was only too well aware of.
I was the secretary of something which, for want of a better phrase, we shall call the muck-up squad. Actually, the terminology was rather more robust than that. But it was a group of backbench MPs, administered by the whips. I was the secretary to the group, who would gather together every week to discuss how to wear down the government. It was a government on the rocks, rocked back on its heels, and it had to be got rid of. And part of that was not just the political argument up front, but actually the day in, day out, night out, wearing them down emotionally and physically until they knew that they couldn't go on.
So we were up late at night, keeping ministers up, trapping them one way and the other into various indiscretions, political indiscretions, I should say. And we were pretty happy. We had a good band of young members of Parliament who were running that government to rags, people like Nigel Lawson and Ian Gow and one or two others of us. And frankly, we were rather enjoying it.
Sometimes desperate measures were required.
Every day you had an emergency crisis, and the whips would meet in the morning and go down the list, and they say, "How's Harry going on?" "Oh, he's in a bad way, he's had an operation." "Bring him in." Ring the surgeon, say, "Can he come in?" And they would keep him in the yard and actually check the ambulance and have the green light on the bleeper going up to see that he was there. We had people who were designated to run around the toilets, bottom flushers and top flushers. I mean, you said, look under the door, and if there's a feet in there, look over the top. If it's ours, get him out, and if it's theirs, leave him in. Because they're probably drunk, you see. It was non-stop alcohol.
The sick and the lame were constantly being brought in. And there were some nights when there were 3 or 4 ambulances in the yard. I remember Barbara Castle, typically of Barbara, had some congestive disease. She came in by ambulance, but insisted on walking through the lobby with all these tubes coming out of her. Typical piece of Barbara bravado. And very often there were people of a sick sort thereabout. In the precincts was the phrase. A barbarous way to behave, but it used to happen in those days.
It felt very much like a crisis a week. It was a real roller coaster ride, and very tense, but very exciting. And but towards the end, when you got into 1979, it just felt that the government was overwhelmed by the crises on every front.
A few months earlier, it had all looked very different.
In the autumn of 1978, the government had been recovering in the polls, was doing quite well, and the economy was going through a brief window of comfort, and there was the prospect of holding an early election, and many of us in Number 10 thought that was what would happen.
The Prime Minister had told the Cabinet he didn't want to be advised about when the election should be. So being young and foolish, I sent him a cheeky letter which said, "I know you don't want to be advised about the election, but if you did want to be advised about the election, I would heartily recommend you held it in September." He ignored this completely.
By now, the pact with the Liberals was over. With the general election looking likely, both sides wanted to campaign separately.
We ended perfectly amicably in the summer of 78, expecting there to be an election in the autumn.
It was a pretty confident government in 78, and I thought it was a good time to take the case to the country.
There was I, waiting at the church. Perhaps you recall how it went on. All at once, he sent me round a note. Here's the very note. This is what he wrote. Can't get away to marry you today. My wife won't let me.
So we were all rather stunned when we watched on television and he sang the song, and it was clear he was not going to hold the election. And that was quite a shock.
A long time afterwards, he came to my house, long after he'd retired. He was on a visit with his wife, holiday in Scotland. They came, and I said to him, why didn't you have the election at that time? And he said, I was advised that I couldn't be certain of getting an overall majority. And my response was, well, what was wrong with that? We were doing quite well, and we'd have done even better with a fresh mandate after an election.
I think I can say now, many years later, that I talked to Jim afterwards, some years afterwards, about why he didn't go for an election in the autumn of '78. And he told me that he felt that he might have won in '78, but that he simply wasn't prepared to go on through another parliament without a majority, having to put up with the sort of things he'd had to put up with during his time as Prime Minister through all the troubles he'd had. And as he said to me, I decided I'd go for a broke, go through the winter. If it went well, I could be back with a majority, and if it didn't, I'd be out.
I think he was very committed to dealing with the inflation problem, and he thought if we could get a low rate of pay rises and low inflation that winter, that would be for him a legacy, an achievement, and he'd like to fight the election in the following year on that.
That winter didn't go as Jim Callaghan had hoped.
At the end of December, pay policy collapsed. Pay policy only worked if everybody was holding the line. And by everybody holding the line, I mean the companies who were employing trade unions demanding more than the pay norm agreed not to pay them. Ford Motor Company refused to do that. We lost the vote in the House of Commons, which would enable us to insist on the Ford Motor Company obeying pay policy, and after that pay policy had virtually disappeared. So had the authority of the government. We'd waged so much of our reputation on holding pay down and holding prices down in consequence that once it was clear we couldn't follow our formula, then the government's reputation was shot.
The pay claims were building up, and they just rose and rose on a ratchet. The policy was for 5%, and first you had the Ford workers, and then you had the water workers and the local authority manuals, and they were going for 9, 10, 15. Then we had the civil service going for 26%. And so the whole thing was rocketing out of control.
You can't get more out of the bank than there is in it. We can just about scrape the 8.8 or somewhere round about there. I keep on saying that. But if they stay out for 1 month, 2 months, 3 months, I shan't in all honesty be able to come back to them and say, sorry, I've suddenly found something, and you can now have a large increase.
It was the first time that public sector workers became militant and bolshy, and it was patently seen that the public sector workers had much more power than they thought that they had. Before that, it was always the private sector, the motor industry, or some other industry which had flexed their muscles.
The Prime Minister was scheduled to go to a big international conference. It wasn't just a nice pleasure trip in the depths of winter, and a terrible winter it was, but there were photographs in the press of him bathing in the sea and sitting on the sands in the beautiful sunshine. And to those of us left behind, and that included me, in Britain, where the weather was dreadful, the freezing cold and everyone was on strike, and so often there was no heat or light. The contrast was politically unhelpful to the Prime Minister.
I promise you that if you look at it from outside, and perhaps you're taking a rather parochial view at the moment, I don't think that other people in the world would share the view that there is mounting chaos.
Well, I think everybody remembers what it was like with strikes and rubbish piling up in the streets, gravediggers not digging the graves. I mean, it was just horrendous. The whole relationship between the government and the trade unions had broken down completely.
No, nobody's been here till... No.
It's a normal day in Tower Hamlets. The rotting garbage in Burdett Street Market has become a health hazard, and the local council are trying to have it moved. Stan Knox sees that they don't.
We get back to West India Dock Road, organise some flying pickets, they're ready. As soon as they get here, Dusty's going to ring us up and we get the pickets down straight away and stop them, you know.
He arranges flying pickets to guard the rubbish heaps of the East End of London.
A little winter of discontent was an enormous factor in wearing down the morale of Labour MPs and of ministers. Frankly, many of them were simply exhausted by the struggle. It's bad enough being a minister at any time, but being a minister in a government where you have a very unreliable majority, where you're being run ragged by late-night sittings and things of that kind, is pretty awful. And you put that against the background of coming into your office in the mornings through the piles of rubbish in the streets and knowing how angry people were, their morale was pretty poor.
By the spring, the government's relations with the unions were improving, but it was facing another crisis, this time over devolution. Referendums were held in Wales and Scotland, but opponents of devolution had won a guarantee that a yes vote would only be valid if backed by 40% of the electorate.
All the propaganda had been prepared before this disaster had occurred. And I remember very clearly posters going up with Jim Callaghan's face with the word yes underneath it. And frankly, by the time the referendum came, nobody in Scotland was minded to say yes to Jim Callaghan.
There had to be a ballot with a 40% turnout. A referendum's not a referendum unless it's a 40% turnout. There wasn't. It was only about a 35% turnout. So then the Scots Nat says the deal's off. You know, it was the English who imposed this level that we had to reach. The deal is off. So we are voting against the government to bring it down.
The failure of devolution was to cost the government vital nationalist support. The Conservatives were watching closely to see which way the 11 Scots nationalist MPs would turn.
My job as Scots Tory whip was to advise as to whether the Scottish National Party members, all 11 of them, would actually vote against the government on a motion of no confidence. We thought that there was just a possibility we might win if every single one of them would vote. I advised they would vote against the government because they were very angry with the Prime Minister, Jim Callaghan, for not implementing devolution in Scotland.
On March the 21st, the SNP tabled a motion of no confidence in the Labour government. The Conservatives were to follow suit.
The Scotland Act and the referendum has brought this debate to a climax. We are at a critical point. What we do in the next few weeks may influence the relations of Scotland with the United Kingdom for many years to come.
Mr. Callaghan speaking to the nation this evening. Tonight we ask, have his statements on devolution today brought his government to the critical point where they can no longer avoid a general election?
The government was under pressure, but the leader of the opposition was also playing a high-stakes game.
There had been votes of confidence, indeed, Margaret had been criticised for calling so many votes of confidence, as if it was a waste of time, votes of confidence that she hadn't won. And it's worth remembering that she was under a lot of criticism at the time, not just, of course, from the Labour government and the Labour Party, but actually from within her own side. She had been elected almost by accident by the Tory party, and many of them were very patronising about her and didn't expect her either to win the election or to last as leader.
This government has had it, and this Parliament has had it, and the sooner we start again, the better.
Just one final prediction from you both, if I will, on knowledge that nobody is probably listening to you. Perhaps, how many will you win by on Wednesday, do you think? Do you want to have a guess?
No, I do not guess on such things. I wait to see the result.
I think we've got a chance of scraping home.
I think we shall win, but I shall wait to see the result.
Mr. Whitelaw, Foreign Secretary, thank you very much.
Callaghan could have survived, but I think both Bernard Donahue in his diaries, and I certainly felt at the time, in a way he reached a stage where he would rather lose with dignity than scrabble about to survive. That wasn't a view that either Bernard or I took. I remember we went to see him with a list.
We really launched an attack on the Prime Minister, suggesting that he ought to make some concessions in order to win the vote. Winning the vote of confidence was what really mattered. But he was really priggish and got a bit upset with us. And he talked as if we were really rather corrupt politicians, and he was a very honourable vicar. He wasn't prepared to do any of those things, which he should have done.
The Secretary of State for Prices, Roy Hattersley, did manage to win the support of 2 Ulster Unionist MPs by offering a special price index for Northern Ireland.
And the extraordinary thing about those two men, who I spent the entire day with, from 10 o'clock in the morning until the vote at 10 o'clock at night, is that they said, and they were right to say, that they could have brought more Ulster Unionists into the lobby if we'd given one particular assurance. And that was the assurance that we'd build a pipeline from somewhere in the United Kingdom, somewhere in Great Britain, to Northern Ireland. And they said that Enoch Powell would be the leader of this group who would abstain and save the government on the basis of the pipeline. I found this very difficult to believe. And since Enoch Powell and I were not exactly blood brothers, I was deeply reluctant to talk to him about it. But I actually passed him, not on the day of the vote, but the day before, in the House of Commons, and said rather nervously, I think we ought to talk. And he said, you mean about the pipeline? And I said, yes. And it was clear this was a goer, this was a possibility. I saw John Smith, my great friend and colleague, John Smith, and talked to my political assistant, David Hill, subsequently the Prime Minister's, Tony Blair's principal spokesman. And they thought there was absolutely no reason to hesitate, that if a pipeline would do the job of saving the government, then a pipeline there ought to be. And I remember David Hill rather cleverly said that I believed in the pipeline anyway. I believed in Morrisonian concept of nationalisation, that a public service available in one part of Britain should be available in another part. So I wasn't doing anything I didn't believe in. I may not have realised it, but I believed in the pipeline. And I went off to see the Prime Minister and said, we can do it. I said to him, I believe in the pipeline. What a comfort to a pipeline. And Jim Callaghan turned the idea down out of hands. This government is not for sale.
But the government's general relationship with the Ulster Unionists was to cost it vital support elsewhere.
The policy in Northern Ireland was generally accepted by everybody except the Irish. And it was increasingly accepted by the Unionist Party of Northern Ireland. Roy Mason, who was a very strong Secretary of State, there are other descriptions of his attitude, but strong is the one I used tonight, had made the Ulster Unionists feel that we were taking a tough line on terrorism. And it made some of the dissident elements feel that he was being brutal towards their dissidents. He'd alienated 2 independent Irishmen, in particular Jerry Fitt.
Roy Mason went native so far as the Unionists were concerned. And in his speeches, on his television appearances, he made himself out to be totally in support of the Unionist case, to the total exclusion of any other form of political opinion. And that created tremendous difficulties for me.
A few days before the confidence vote, Jerry Fitt met the Prime Minister in Downing Street.
He told me how close the vote was going to be. And I was totally honest with him. I said, look, there's no way that I can support your government whilst Roy Mason, the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland. It would be against all my principles and the people that I represent. And he had, I remember as well, he had the figures in this little pocket in here. And he took them out, and he was very correct. He said 311 to 310 if the vote goes the way he expected to go. And I said, well, Jim, no, I can't vote for him. And then he did something which certainly pushed me into the position whereby there was no retreat. He nodded at someone, and they brought out a bottle of gin and a bottle of tonic and set it down on the table before me. And I didn't like that one little bit.
This way, Mrs. Thatcher. Nice. How do you think it's going to go tonight?
I'm not prophesying. We shall know in about 13 and a half hours, and I'm prepared to wait. I'm looking forward to it being over.
And you think it's going to be a successful result?
We're hopeful. We're hopeful. I think it's an even chance.
Because there's only 2 votes. It's pretty tight.
Indeed, but you know, when it's only 2, anything can happen.
We gathered under the leadership of the Chief Whip early in the morning, and we were all meant to account for our members and know exactly where they were, and a very short roll call was made of those who weren't immediately in the vicinity of Westminster.
The mood was very sombre. We knew what the stakes were. We knew the government could lose.
I was confident that we could get every single Conservative Member of Parliament to vote, and I was also certain that if the Scottish National Party put down a motion of no confidence, then every single one of their 11 members would vote for it.
We used to have reports from the whips in number 10 every few hours, and they ranged from that we would win by 1 through that it would be a tie, down to the worst we heard was we might lose by 3.
Gambling on politics rather than in it is a growth industry, and tonight's chancy outcome has invited tens of thousands into the betting shops. Whether the general public is better informed or merely staring at the tea leaves is open to question. But one large firm of bookmakers has no doubt where the punters are putting their money.
The public are definitely putting on the money on Mr. Callaghan to stay in power. They put a lot of money on at 2 to 1, at 7 to 4, at 6 to 4. They're still putting money on Mr. Callaghan.
A lot of very serious arithmetic has been done about this vote of no confidence. However, it would seem that some people are confident enough in their own predictions of the result to lay individual bets of 400, 2,000, even 5,000 pounds on the result.
Before going across for the speeches, members of staff from all parts of the House gathered to give him a cheering send-off. Outside were hordes of television cameramen. We all streamed into our cars and zoomed off to the House.
Churchill once famously said that he wanted to keep the House of Commons smaller than the number of members that were allowed to sit there, because on the great occasions there should be a sense of crowd and urgency about the place. You understand what he meant if you were there that night. There was the theatre of the thing. I can remember that the House looked a kind of honey colour and was packed.
Mr. Speaker, sir, I beg to move that this House has no confidence in Her Majesty's government.
We realised that debate was going to be crucial. Nobody knew what the outcome was going to be, not even in the higher reaches of government. Nobody was certain what was going to happen.
It's not unusual for minority governments to carry on for a considerable period of time as this one has. What condemns the Prime Minister now is the justified feeling that the substance of matters before the House takes second place to the survival of the government.
So this evening, the Conservative Party, who want the Act repealed and oppose even devolution, will march through the lobby with the SNP, who want independence for Scotland, and with the Liberals who want to keep the Act. What a massive display of unsullied The minority parties have walked into a trap. If they win, there will be a general election. And I am told that the current joke going round the House is that it's the first time in recorded history that turkeys have been known to vote for an early Christmas.
With Gerry Fitt's support in doubt, Labour's hopes were pinned on the MP for Fermanagh and South Tyrone, the publican Frank Maguire.
Let me say his attendance was pretty limited and sporadic, but he was over for this vote.
He owned a pub in a village called Lisnaskay, and he was one of the nicest fellows you ever met. But he had no idea of the political situation as it was then in Northern Ireland. And at that time, there were lots of atrocities taking place, many of them on his own doorstep in Fermanagh. And Frank never condemned them, whereas I was never off television or in the press condemning the atrocities, particularly by the IRA at that time. And I would meet Frank coming over in the plane, and I would say to him, you know, well, why did you not condemn that atrocious murder which took place last week in your constituency? He says, Jerry, he says, I own a pub, he says, in Lisnaskay, and if I start condemning the IRA, he says, it'll blow up my pub.
Have either of the main parties been in touch with you, seeking your vote tonight?
I have had talks with some of the Labour folks.
When did you have talks with them?
Over the weekend.
And have you any reason to believe that they might be going towards your position on
Well,
this?
hopefully. We're preempting the issue at the moment. Hopefully, like, they'll get a...
But what's the most likely position at the moment, an abstention?
No decision at all at the moment. Late afternoon we'll decide or make my decision.
Have the Conservatives been in touch with you as well?
Absolutely not.
Not?
Not at all. Thank you.
Thank you.
He was Labour in his instincts and had been known to support us. But we heard he was coming over under firm instructions from the Republican side not to vote for the government. So we assigned one of our whips, who was my local MP, I think, Jock Stallard, who was a good Catholic man and therefore the right man to assign, and we assigned him to monitor Frank, and he stayed with him all day, moving from bar to bar, as Jock told me afterwards, and he discovered that Frank Maguire could drink more than he could. So it was a very tough assignment. And his job was to try to persuade Frank to come into the lobby and vote for the Labour side, because he was basically a Labour man.
I remember watching in the vote some Labour whips trying to persuade him, and indeed imploring him to vote, but he just sat out the entire vote after having been flown over, which was one of the remarkable features of that night.
Jock Stallard deployed every conceivable strategy in the book and held out, right up to the very last moment, held the hope that he might just persuade him to join us in the lobby.
But there's a rumour circulating in the House today. If it's true, it is despicable that the Honourable Member for Fermanagh South Tyrone is somewhere within this building talking to some government members or some people from the Whip's office. But he's not going to be able to talk to me in case I persuade him to do the same as I am going to do tonight. I understand, and I will be watching very, very carefully. If the Honourable Member for Fermanagh and South Tyrone goes through the government lobby tonight, then it will be in opposition to everything that his constituents sent him here to do. And it would be a completely dishonest thing to do, not having been in this House, not having been here today, not having cast a vote on all the issues that I have mentioned, not having made speeches to give it the benefit of what he thought of them.
And little did I know when I was making that speech that his wife was in the public gallery. And as soon as she heard me making that speech, she rushed into Frank and said, "There's no way you can vote for the government after what Jerry had said about you there."
They kept Frank Maguire under control until round about 7 o'clock in the evening, when somehow or other he escaped from his minders and met his wife, Mrs. Maguire, and she took him home.
Jerry Fitt made his own statement to the House that evening.
In all conscience and an understanding of the real needs of Northern Ireland, that I would be a liar to my own conscience, and I would be a traitor to the people who sent me here if I were to go into the government lobby tonight and express confidence in this administration in relation to its affairs in Northern Ireland. Let me say this. I want to see this government having an election as soon as possible, and I want to see it winning. And I want to see it having such a majority that it will never again have to rely on votes from the Unionist Party in Northern Ireland.
Meanwhile, the Prices Secretary was spending that day with the two Ulster Unionists, Harold McCusker and John Carson.
We went to lunch in the cafeteria and we produced a statement on prices policy in Northern Ireland. And this was written and rewritten. It was rewritten and then typed out by David Hill on my constituency secretary's portable typewriter. And then they signed it, and I picked up a biro from my desk in the upper ministerial corridor and signed it. For some extraordinary reason, the biro turned out to be green. They didn't like me signing in green, so we had to type it all over again so I could sign in black. It was a day of considerable farce.
The government whips had one last card to play. It all hinged on Sir Alfred Broughton, Labour MP for Batley and Morley. He'd been brought down by ambulance from Yorkshire for previous votes, but by March 1979, Doc Broughton, as he was known, was gravely ill.
And I was part of a little group the Chief Whip set up to discuss the crucial marginal votes. And one of the great questions which we discussed, I think, for 3 or 4 days before the actual vote, was whether Doc Broughton should be brought down or not.
He had been brought in for previous votes in an ambulance, and then, of course, you can vote, not in the chamber, that is allowed. And that was contemplated, but Jim Callaghan again said, don't do that. It's quite wrong to risk his life because he was fatally ill.
There was then thought about what happens if Doc Broughton dies on the way down. And we first of all thought this was too horrid a prospect to contemplate. And then somebody said, not me, somebody wise said, of course, if he's in the House of Commons, he hasn't died because nobody dies in the House of Commons. So you have to die later in St Thomas's Hospital. So we sort of pushed the idea of him dying out of our minds. But he himself wanted to come. He was a loyalist, he was a brave man, he was an honourable man. He knew he was going to die in the next couple of weeks, as he did. And he thought his last service to the Labour Party would be to come down and vote or be nodded through, sitting in or lying in the ambulance in the yard.
The whips, I remember, came and said, we can get him down, and they wanted to get him down. But Jim Callaghan said no, and then at the last minute, the Prime Minister changed his mind and said, all right, try, but it was too late.
I went to my opposite number, Walter Harrison, with whom I always had a very close and honourable arrangement, and said to him, well, Walter, I'm afraid this is it. You've had it tonight. Not at all, he said. I said, well, we've lost Frank Maguire. No, but he said, we've got Dr. Broughton. And I said, well, you can't bring him in. I said, you haven't got time to bring him in anyway. It's 7 o'clock and he won't be here in time. But he said, I am now formally asking you to honour your word. I said, what on earth are you talking about? He said, well, we've always had an agreement to pair sick with sick. And I'm formally asking for a pair to cover Dr. Broughton. I said, but Walter, I haven't got a pair, a motion, no confidence. He said, nevertheless, he said, I am formally asking you to honour your word on this. And I said, well, Walter, I must tell you that I agree we've always had this gentleman's agreement, but I haven't got a pair. But I will keep my word, and I shall stand out tonight. I won't vote. Well, Walter then said to me, I'm not going to put you in that position.
I've got to tell you, Walter had not told us that that offer was on, because I think we might have accepted.
The whips had ordered all Labour MPs to be present at 7 p.m. for a head count.
Because there were no catering services available in the palace at the time because of a dispute, all the members might be registered and be seen by their whips by 7 o'clock, but there was precious little we could do except moral persuasion to hold them there when they said, well, we've got to get refreshments from somewhere. So we did watch certain numbers scatter, which was a cause of the greatest anxieties you could imagine. And that's why at 9:30 in the evening we did do a trawl of all the outbuildings at Westminster, including some of the watering holes, and I had St Stephen's Tavern, which was one of the most notorious, I think.
In the chamber, the Leader of the House, Michael Foot, was winding up the debate for the government.
I do recall Michael Foot's brilliant speech summing up for the government. I mean, he was, in my view, a pretty hopeless leader of the Labour Party, but he was a brilliant debater, and he had a very entertaining but quite savage jibe at me when he pointed his fingers across and said,
"He's passed from rising hope to elder statesman without any intervening period whatsoever."
Outside the chamber, increasingly frantic efforts were being made to round up any missing Labour MPs.
Well, the vote was at 10, and I think at about 10 minutes to 10 I'd finished all my main patrols, except for St Stephen's Tavern, where one of my colleagues was rather securely placed between two lobby correspondents, neither of them of newspapers sympathetic to the government's cause, who seemed to be plying him with rather substantial amounts of both whisky and decent bitter, and I was worried where his judgment was at that stage, so I decided he'd got to come with me there and then.
Question is that this House has no confidence in Her Majesty's government. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. The contrary, no. No. I think the noes have it.
Right to the very end, the vote seemed too close to call. And for those totting up the scores, the maths proved challenging.
When the vote took place, the Scots Labour whip, Jimmy Hamilton, rushed through, giving the thumbs-up signal.
Everybody thought, we've survived, we survived.
And then we heard on the radio that one of the Labour whips had come into the chamber with his thumbs raised, making sure that, you know, and it was just total desolation.
The only time in my life I've ever sat in Members' Gallery waiting for the vote, and therefore able to read Mrs. Thatcher's lips when, with apprehension, she said, "I don't believe it," because her whips had given her the wrong figure. They'd forgotten to include the two tellers in the count, so it looked as if the opposition had lost. And I remember the joy with which I read Mrs. Thatcher saying, "I don't believe it," but I'm afraid it was true.
Order. Order. Order.
The ayes to the right, 311. The noes to the left, 310.
It was an amazing piece of theatre, and in a way a sad end to that Labour government, but at least it went down fighting.
Now that the House of Commons has declared itself, we shall take our case to the country.
But why we wanted to bring Callaghan down, well, there were all sorts of different reasons, but just that night it was for him the perfect storm.
if you had known that your vote was going to bring about 18 years of Maggie Thatcher, would you have done what you did? In those circumstances, I would have had to do what I did, because it was the whole situation in Northern Ireland, and I was there to represent Northern Ireland.